It's my pleasure to introduce Tracey Wilson-Holden. She is our Director of Research Integrity and Education here at CASE, and she's going to go over some very important information that each of you need to know. Tracey?
Well, good morning. It's great to see such a big group out there. That's a good sign. So, as Denise said, I'm the Director of Research Integrity and Education. I work in research administration, and as in that role, what I do are sort of two different things and sort of on two sides of the spectrum. The first half of it is the education side, which is doing things like this, coming out and talking to groups of people, either faculty or students, staff members, on what the regulations are, how they can be practically applied in most cases. And I much prefer that to the other side of the spectrum, which is the integrity side. I'm the Research Integrity Officer for the university, which means I'm charged with assessing allegations of research misconduct for the university. So what I've found is that it's a lot more fun I've lost my microphone, sorry. It's a lot more fun and interesting to come out and talk to you guys when nobody's in trouble or nobody thinks they're in trouble. So this is a much nicer audience than the other side of the spectrum. So what I'd like to talk to you about today is some of my experiences in some of the areas that I have encountered in doing that other side with the integrity. So we're going to talk about, I've kind of altered this presentation and kind of focused it on some of the things that I thought might be important to all of you, as I understand it, who are just beginning your dissertation research. So some of the very important factors, I think, are all of the different aspects of data management and many of the mentoring issues that I think are just really important to get an understanding of, to get an idea of what the expectations are on both sides of the spectrum for mentoring. And in such, I want to talk very briefly about some of these other issues, including authorship, peer review, and collaborative research. And of course, since I am the Research Integrity Officer, I can't ever miss an opportunity to talk to you about research misconduct. And what I consider to be research misbehaviors, which I like to call all of that other stuff that isn't misconduct that I just talked about on the previous slide, doing all of that badly. So that's generally what we come up with whenever we see these behaviors that are less than ideal but aren't actually research misconduct. So the way that I thought I'd organize it today is to talk to you about the general areas of concern for each of those areas, tell you where it exists, what the federal regulation and guidance says, what our local policies and procedures are, and we'll go from there. So let's start with data management. And it sounds like just one topic, but actually it's a bunch of different things. And so we're going to talk about acquisition of data, analysis of data, security for data, data sharing, and data custody and retention. And each of those things actually has at least some guidance, if not regulation, associated with it. And I realized I was able to, Denise sent me an idea of where all of you are from. And so I know I've got some folks here who do medical kinds of research, biomedical research. I know I've got some people from Weatherhead School of Management and MSAS, lots of people from engineering, and so I'm not going to talk to you about biomedical research and working in a laboratory, and I'm not going to talk to you about intellectual property from an engineering perspective, but I'm going to try to be kind of more broader based than that and just give you the general ideas, understanding all along that the particulars are very different for the different kinds of research that you do. So, as I said, there's lots of different areas for data management and a lot of different policies and a lot of different regulation here. So these are just some of them, and actually it ends up taking up 2 slides because it was too small to fit on all one. These are all of our several of our human subjects regulations. And I like to give you the links in these presentations because there is no way that I'm going to either tell you everything you ever needed to know today, or that even if I did tell you, that you would remember. And so I like to give you the links to the policies and the regulations so that when and if, hopefully not, but when and if an issue comes up that you need some clarification with, you have the direct link to go to where you need to see exactly what the regs say. In addition to all of those national and federal policies that we have that we need to follow, Then there are some additional policies on the local level, in other words, case policies, that generally follow the regulations pretty exactly, but may add a couple of additional requirements for you. And so the local policies, as far as data management go, are generally found in what's called the faculty handbook. Now, that doesn't mean that it only applies to faculty. That's just a nice place to put all of those particular pieces of information. And so even though it's called the faculty handbook, it really does apply to faculty, staff, and students, and it generally outlines our ideas on good research and policy here at the university. And so those regulations do apply as far as intellectual property, privacy and confidentiality, and the policies on custody of research data. Those are all found there. So let's get into some of the particulars. Data acquisition. Again, I know I'm talking to a really wide group of folks, and so I can't tell you how to acquire your data. And that's why, obviously, you have a PI who I'm sure is involved with what you're doing as well, who can talk to you specifically about how it is that you're supposed to acquire your data. But what I can tell you, and actually as I say them, they really sound very common sense like, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they're done consistently throughout the institution or throughout research in general. Some of the particulars about how you want to be acquiring your data come from guidance from the national or from the federal agencies. For instance, NIH says research data should be carefully recorded in a form that will allow continuous access for analysis and review. They also say attention should be given to annotating and indexing notebooks and documenting computerized information to facilitate review of data. From the National Academy of Sciences, the general standard of practice is to provide information regarding how the data was generated such that another individual can repeat or extend the study. So, that being said, looking at it from the research misconduct perspective and from the integrity perspective, as you're acquiring your data, I know we all expect that everything will go peachy and perfectly as you progress throughout your dissertation research. But as you're acquiring your data, the safest and best way for you to be doing that is to think and expect that it's going to be questioned at some point, because it likely will be, whether that's in a negative way or just as clarification and making sure that you can go back a year from now, 6 months from now, whenever that may be. You want to be sure that it's all been recorded very accurately and clearly with all the information that you need, so that you can indeed follow your own path backwards and see where everything is, and expect that your work will need to stand up to scrutiny. Can you prove that you actually did that experiment? Can you prove that you actually went out to that facility and interviewed that individual? Whatever the case may be, you need to be able to prove it, and you need to be able to have the dates and everything associated with that to show your actual raw data in whatever form that might be. Okay, whether that actually comes from a computer or whether that comes from an interview or whatever that might be. You want to be able to prove that the data is accurate and it came from the time that you actually acquired it. So as far as data analysis goes, again, all the data, even from observations and experiments not directly leading to publication, should be treated comparably. So chances are you're not going to know what you're going to publish whenever you're actually acquiring the data. You're trying to figure that out as you go along. But all of the data, whether or not you consider it to be primary to what you're planning to do, ought to be treated comparably and recorded in a careful manner and analyzed in a careful manner. And then, obviously, I hope that you all know this, but we'll just go over it carefully. It is a violation of the most fundamental aspect of scientific research process to set forth measurements that have not in fact been performed, which equates to fabrication of data, or to ignore or change relevant data that contradict reported findings, which would be considered falsification. Significantly changing something, or changing something at all, such that it changes or alters the results of the data, or the interpretation of the data. As far as the Office of Management and Budget goes, they say that models used to analyze data should be made available to the public. So not only, again, it needs to stand up to scrutiny. Just because you analyzed it that way doesn't mean that that is the way it is. You need to be able to show the entire process by which you analyzed your data to get the end result that you got. And you need to be able to document that clearly so that someone else could follow your same process and hopefully get the exact same result, either with their own data that they've acquired or looking back on your data to be able to get those exact same results. As far as data security and confidentiality goes, I think for those of you who might do human subjects research, we think about data security and confidentiality quite a bit. But in reality, it's true for all kinds of research, whether it's human subjects research or not. It's just the IRB tends to think about this very clearly for you if you haven't thought about it for yourself. So some of the things that we want to make sure that we're doing are password protecting computers or laptops if you're using them. One of the big ones is we've seen this unfortunately more than 1 or 2 times, is folks getting their laptop computers stolen from their cars, which contain their research data. Now, if that's not password protected and you do human subjects research, well, you've just done a major violation because you've got human subjects data that is now accessible to someone and you don't know who that person is or what they're going to do with that computer data. But for your own purposes, whether or not it's human subjects research, you've lost your data. So backing up is obviously very important, and primarily not storing your laptop in your car or somewhere else that it can be stolen, right? So those are just some of the things that we certainly want to be thinking about when we talk about data security and confidentiality. The sponsor of your research may have particular ideas about how they want you to protect that data as well. And certainly, again, going back to the proprietary kinds of information, you may be doing a kind of research where that data does indeed need to be secured for the purposes of not letting anyone else find out what kind of data it is besides human subjects data. Let's see. And confidentiality concerns will obviously dictate how the data is collected, retained, and shared. So then talking about data sharing. This is one of probably the biggest areas in data management where there's a lot of policy, a lot of guidance on how data can be shared between folks. And there are a couple of different ways, actually several different ways that you can think about data sharing. You can think about sharing your research data with the scientific community for the betterment of science, right? We can think about one of the more recent kinds of sharing that has been brought to light is the sharing of your research data with the public. In the case of NSF-funded research or NIH-funded research or many of those federal agencies, it is indeed the public who has paid for your research in the indirect way. And so they have a right to know what it is that you're doing. And so we need to think about it from that perspective, and there's some guidance and some regulation as far as that goes. Another way of thinking about the data sharing is you as a Ph.D. student who are working with a PI, you guys both have a right to that data. And so there needs to be sharing once the two of you part ways between the PI who remains at the institution and the student who then has moved on. There are rights and responsibilities associated with both, and that data does indeed need to be shared across those relationships as well. So the second point here, NIH says that sharing data, particularly unique data, is essential for the expedited translation of research results into knowledge, products, and procedures to improve human health. And then our local policy kind of addresses that student-PI relationship. In group research projects, the PI is obligated to give co-investigators access to research data or copies thereof for review and or use in follow-on research with proper acknowledgement. Now that proper acknowledgement piece does indeed play in as well. So data custody and retention is another area of concern. And quite honestly, there's no very consistent answer to how long data ought to be retained. We'll talk about retention first. So some of the funding agencies will tell you, depending on what your funding is, how long that data has to be maintained. But that varies. It can be 2 years, it can be 3 years, it can be 6 years. With some of the hospital research, if an individual is doing pediatric research on human subjects, for instance, Metro Health says that that data must be maintained until the individual turns 21, who was the research subject. And so you've got a very long time frame of data retention there as far as that, as that goes. From my perspective in investigating a misconduct case, I can go back for about 6 years. According to the regulations, to investigate something that happened 6 years ago. So those numbers are sort of all across the board. Our local policy on data retention and custody says not less than 3 years after the final closeout or publication, whichever occurs last. And it indicates that original data ought to be maintained whenever possible. Generally, what we as an institution like to see is that the original data associated with any research stays here at the institution, particularly in funded cases. And then as a student, copies of everything are accessible to you, and you can take a copy of that when you go. Now, if that's not possible based on the kinds of research that you do, and again, I realize that it's easier to make a copy of a transcript of an interview than it might be to make a copy of some other kind of data. There can be exceptions. And there can be signed agreements where a student takes their original data with them but signs an agreement that the university has access, because we are legally obligated by these federal agencies to be able to access that data in the future. So, so there are ways to work around it and to make it fit the kind of research that you do. But in all cases, the university must maintain some kind of access to that data, and the student must also have some access to that data. So let's move on to mentoring. I'm assuming all of you have a mentor at this point, right? Is that generally true? Yes? Okay. Okay, I'm going to throw out there the idea that there are no bad mentors, there are no bad mentees, but there are certainly lots of bad mentoring relationships. How about that? I'm not blaming anybody here. I'm just saying that sometimes the relationship isn't always ideal. Okay? So what generally comes, however, from a bad mentoring relationship can frequently be bad science, and therein is our problem. Okay? And my interest in it in general. Not only my interest, but the federal agencies have recognized this and have recently come down with some pretty big changes and requirements for institutions to make sure that these things are being addressed. And by that, they are requiring things having to do with responsible conduct in research, which I'm kind of sneaking in the back door and talking to you about responsible conduct in research today without exactly calling it that. But some of the things that the particularly NIH and NSF are beginning to require are that for undergraduate students, graduate students, and postdoctoral scholars, that they all be trained in the responsible conduct of research. Now that's all fine and great, and we can do that in large group sessions where people like me and other administrators come out and talk to folks about how to do this kind of stuff appropriately. But the newer regulations and the newer guidance indicates that they actually want the faculty to be involved in that process as well. In small groups, they want them to be talking about making sure that the science goes well and that the students know what their requirements are and what their obligations are to do good science. And that has to do with data management. It has to do with authorship, peer review, collaborative science, research misconduct, animal subjects, human subjects, conflict of interest, and one more. There are actually 9 areas that they talk about specifically. So from that perspective, again, I know that there are good mentoring relationships and I know there are bad mentoring relationships, but what I wanted to tell you about today a little is that there is some federal guidance from the National Academy of Science. They've done a book on how that relationship ought to go. NIH has actually a guide for training for their intramural research program, but not really one for their extramural research, which is generally what most of you all would be doing. On the local level, our Graduate Student Senate has come out with 2 guidebooks, one for our faculty as mentors and one for the mentees, because indeed there are specific responsibilities and expectations for both sides of the spectrum. And I think those are great publications, and I really highly recommend that all of you take a look at those. Know what is expected of you and what is expected of the mentor. But I would certainly say that probably of all of the things that are listed, the most important thing in that relationship is an open communication between the two of you. So in general, what you as a student, as a PhD student, should expect from a mentor is that there be some level of commitment of time to the relationship, right? It's not just a name on a piece of paper who signs off for you once a year. There should be some level of time commitment to you and to your research. That individual ought to provide feedback. Now, it should be a constructive feedback, but I'm not going to guarantee that that's the way it's exactly going to turn out, because personalities differ and relationships differ. So there should be feedback that progresses you in your research. Back to the time commitment, I think that having meetings regularly is certainly an expectation. These, your PhD should not rely on a conversation in a hallway whenever you happen to run into the individual who is supposed to be overseeing your research. So there should be some level of expectation that meetings are scheduled regularly, and what regularly means depends on what kind of research you're doing, I think. And I can't tell you that it should be every month or every 2 months or every week. That is completely dependent upon the kind of work that you do. But you should have an expectation that there's an ongoing and regular cycle to the meetings that you have. Hopefully your mentor is assisting you with creating a program and a career roadmap. And again, there should be an outline and expectations for the kinds of drafts toward your dissertation that you're doing. Hopefully, along the path of your research, there will be opportunities to publish and present. And I think that that's an important factor to discuss. We'll talk about that a little bit in just a few minutes with authorship issues as well. And the honesty factor, which I have listed there last, is again, communication and honesty, I think, are very important factors. It needs to be a relationship that is functional, that is actually progressing both you and your research. And so that we don't think that it's all up to the mentor, I actually have listed here. What you don't see on there is that they need to be your personal counselor. They don't need to be your cheerleader. They don't need to be your mom or your dad. And they don't need to be at your beck and call, right? So you're not undergrads anymore. And obviously, you guys are a very mature crowd here, and I'm sure you all know that. But at this level, there is an expectation that you have, a great level of independence, and you obviously want that at this level. And of course, they probably are going to fill each one of those roles at some time or other. But from the perspective of all of you, there are very big responsibilities that go along with this as well. And so that requires proactivity on your part, being responsible, having realistic expectations of what that individual can and should do. And an important factor, being actively engaged in your profession. You need to be able to receive criticism in a professional manner. Feedback, letting the mentor know that you are doing what they're recommending, or at least trying to do that. And again, the honesty factor. So those are just some of the issues that I wanted to bring up. Now briefly, I wanted to talk about these 3 other issues, which are actually an hour-long presentation in and of themselves. But I wanted to just talk about authorship. Again, there is local guidance on authorship standards. Our faculty handbook does outline that there needs to be sufficient participation in the research to be able to respond to questions about the work. And there needs to be a substantial contribution to probably at least one, if not many more, of the ideas of the concept of the research, the design, the acquisition of the data, the analysis of the data and interpretation, and the drafting and revising of any manuscript that is being created. The order of authors is also something that comes up quite frequently, and an issue of gift authorship. Now, I bring up these authorship issues because I would say that besides these bad mentoring relationships that I often hear about, so I've got this group of people who come and talk to me, and there's actually misconduct involved, and those are maybe 2 or 3, if that, times a year. But that doesn't mean that I don't talk to anybody else in the interim. I get lots of other conversations and consultations that come to my office and things that we discuss. And so many of those are mentoring relationship issues where folks just aren't communicating and one has decided to come and tell on the other one. And being the mother of 2 7-year-olds, I'm really familiar with tattletaling, and so I can handle that. But seriously, the other issue that comes up quite frequently are authorship issues. And that can be everything from a student or an ex-student coming back and saying, the PI that I worked with when I was at Case won't publish this data. On the other hand, you've got the other side of the spectrum, the PI here at Case, calling me and saying, the student has taken the data and is trying to publish it without acknowledging my grant or without acknowledging that they did the work at Case. And we've got all sorts of other scenarios going on with authorship. One person was doing the research and we had originally agreed that he would be the first author, but then now he's no longer doing the research and I have someone else who has to replicate the data because it can't be used in its old format, and so now I want to put that new guy as the first author and the other guy as the second author. And so you can see that these issues are far from easily defined. And so, again, I think probably one of the very biggest factors is communication. And one of the things that I've seen multiple times in the research is the idea of a research prenuptial agreement, which sounds lovely. And probably not incredibly realistic, but the idea is really a good one, where there is an actual formal conversation, at least up front, or as close to up front as possible. Now, I doubt that there's a room full of people at any point who sit down and say, okay, we're going to do some research here, and you're going to be the first author, and you're going to do the data collection, and I'm going to be the last author because it's my lab, and okay, so what are we going to do for our research? Now, it kind of tends to go the other way, doesn't it? The research gets done, somebody does this, somebody does that, whatever, and at some point you realize you have something worth publishing. And then you start having maybe those talks about who's going to write it, and there may be some hurt feelings, and there may be some changes of personnel along the way, and who ends up as an author? Who ends up as the first author? Who ends up as the second author? All of those issues come up. And so I bring it up to you only to recommend and to suggest that this is something that is likely to occur at some point, either here while you're at Case or in your career at some point. And it's important to have an open communication not only at the beginning whenever there's a final decision that something is going to be produced, but throughout. As you see changes occurring, it's important to have that open communication to ensure that everybody's still on the same page. And I'm still going to be the first author on this, right? Because I'm the one who's staying here until 2 in the morning writing it, right? Those kinds of conversations I think are important to continue to have throughout the research so that there's no surprise at the end. Again, here's the local policy, University Guidelines on Authorship and Research, and scholarly publications there. In the same light, collaborative research is not something that perhaps you're going to be directly involved in at this point, but I'm not sure. It depends on the kind of research you do again. And there are lots of new kinds of collaboration occurring between academia and industry, cross-discipline, translational research, international research. All of these kinds of collaborative partnerships are occurring. And again, one of my big themes is the communication is essential regarding authorship, accountability, data management, and all of that kind of stuff, as well as far as this collaborative stuff goes, it may very well be important to involve the Technology Transfer Office, Grants and Contracts, or the Clinical Trials Offices. Because in general, you're talking about, in most instances, you're talking about another outside institution plus those folks here at CASE who are collaborating. And there is some good guidance out there for this. NIH and NSF both have some guidance as far as collaborative research goes. And we have a lot of policies that indirectly address partnerships. So data custody, authorship, intellectual property, conflict of interest, and contracts and subcontracts policy talk about how those partnerships ought to occur. I am going to very briefly talk about peer review, as I don't expect. I'll try to do this carefully. So peer review is generally meant to be something that a faculty member does, right? And I'm sure you're all familiar with the peer review process. Either the review of grants, applications for NIH, NSF, any other federal agency, or a publication that is under review for publication in a scholarly journal. Now, in general, when we talk about peer review, it's important to consider whether or not the person who is conducting the review has the expertise to do the review, whether they have a conflict of interest, whether they're direct collaborators, direct competitors with the person whose manuscript they're reviewing, and whether or not they have the time available to give it an appropriate review. Now, the part that I wanted to talk to you briefly about is the confidentiality issue. Generally, and I would say probably nearly, if not 100% of the time, there are confidentiality clauses and important issues when people are doing peer review for either a grant application or a manuscript. And generally that includes the fact that nobody else is supposed to see it except that one individual who has been asked to do the review. So why do I bring it up, right? You guys probably shouldn't see these at all. Because the reality is, and I'm not saying it's here at CASE or anywhere in particular, but there is a wealth of case study knowledge out there of PIs who share peer-reviewed articles or peer-reviewed grant applications with their graduate students. And in general, it can be just a process by which they want you to see what's out there and how the process is done. If you become a faculty member, it's something you're going to need to be doing. And so from one perspective, it is indeed a growing experience for a graduate student to see these and to perhaps participate in that review. On the other hand, it's actually not expected to be permissible. So I mention it only in the fact that it is important that all of you understand the requirement of confidentiality as far as this goes. It is not okay to use what you see in a grant application for your own purposes or to advance your own research. Obviously, the methods and all of that stuff are all held under confidentiality, and folks can be investigated and found guilty of research misconduct for using information. Whether that grant eventually becomes funded or not, it's still proprietary information and not meant for the public or for anyone else except those specific individual peer reviewers to see. So, so that's what I have to say on that. And again, generally, the federal agencies have very clear policies on that, as do the journals. And I'm going to finish up by talking briefly about research misconduct, and indeed we have talked about a couple of the aspects of it already. So research misconduct is really narrowly defined as falsification, fabrication, and plagiarism in research design and methods. So we've got several different organizations, the Office of Research Integrity, which handles NIH-funded research, as well as several other federal agencies. National Science Foundation has their own policies regarding research misconduct. And our local policy also discusses research misconduct. And they all three pretty much line up exactly. So whether or not it's NIH funded or NSF funded or not funded at all, it's going to be reviewed under the same process if there is an allegation of research misconduct. So the definitions essentially, falsification is manipulating research materials, equipment, processes, or changing or omitting data or results such that the research is not accurately represented in the research record. And so I think it's important to realize that that includes research materials, equipment, processes, and it also includes changing, which is what you might anticipate for falsification, but it also includes omitting. So that outlier, that if you just got rid of it, would make your data look so much nicer. If you choose to delete that and not include it, that could be considered falsification of data. Okay? And so it's important to understand that particular, and I think that's probably the one area most of us realize that we're not supposed to change the data that actually comes out of the machine or whatever the case may be. As far as fabrication goes, that's pretty much exactly what you would expect. Making up data or results and recording or reporting them. So we've kind of talked about those already. What I wanted to spend just a few minutes talking about is plagiarism. From our university policy, plagiarism is defined as the appropriation of another person's ideas, processes, results, or words without giving appropriate credit. From the academic integrity policy, plagiarism is the presentation without proper attribution of another's words or ideas from printed or electronic sources. So it adds a little twist there with the electronics, and that's certainly included in the research misconduct policy as well, whether it's an electronic manuscript or not, or whether it's something you see on the web or not. Any kind of direct copying of data or of words is considered to be plagiarism. But we've got a couple of, going back to my 7-year-olds, they're already yelling at each other across the table. They're twins, and so they have 2 different teachers but the same homework every night. And believe me, regularly I hear, "He's looking at my paper!" And so we know that from that perspective, even as a 7-year-old, they know that they're not supposed to copy things from one paper to another, right? And so that's pretty easy, and we've been doing that all of our lives as students. And but what becomes harder as far as the plagiarism side of things goes is the ideas of the lab's words. So perhaps someone is working under a principal investigator who has been working on the same kinds of research for the last 20 years. Okay? That individual has had multiple graduate students, Ph.D. students, all of whom are kind of following on each other, right? So they're expanding the research, they're progressing the research, but they're all starting from perhaps a very similar base. And so over those years, people get the idea of, or the terminology has been refined, right? The process has been refined, the methods have been refined, such that it's very clear, very concise over the years how this process works. Well, you are an individual student who is charged with writing your own paper. And so whether or not those very clear and concise words may be the very best and very clearest way of writing that introduction or that literature review, it is meant to be your very own work. And so it's important to realize that there is no such thing as the lab's words. So if it is a dissertation, it needs to be your words. Whether we're talking about the results and conclusions, or whether we're talking about the parts that you may not consider to be the most important aspect of your work, whether it's the methods section, or whether it is the introduction section, all of those aspects of the papers really are meant to be your own individual work. And so it's very important to think about it from that perspective, that anybody's words that were used before are not yours, even if you're working under the same group. Now, if you were an author on that paper also, or whatever it might be, there may be, it may be a situation where it's okay for you to use some of those words, but there are some other issues that one needs to think about from that perspective. Some of the other things that are important to think about are grant applications, whether funded or not funded. Those words belong to whomever wrote that grant application. And if you were one of the folks who wrote that grant application, again, that may be a factor. But then if if you're one of 6 people who was on that grant application and now you're going to publish a paper that has only you as the author, that's a very important distinction, because that grant application included the work of 6 people. It's not yours alone. And so those are some things to think about. And then another aspect of plagiarism that I think is really very unclear, but yet I have seen cases or I've heard people coming and talking to me about are ideas that occur in a group setting. And, and truly, people may not remember who said what, but if it's someone's idea and then someone else chooses to follow up on that, there can be an issue where at least somebody cries plagiarism, because plagiarism can include an idea. Okay, so it doesn't need to always be exact written words, but it can be someone's idea also that can be plagiarized. And so it's important to give credit where credit is due, and to not give anybody the impression that something is one's own original idea when perhaps it is not. And I talked about this a little bit already. NSF's policy on plagiarism: the responsibility for proper attribution and citation rests with authors of a proposal, and all parts of the proposal should be prepared with equal care for this concern. So not just the results and conclusion, but the entire paper. I'm going to leave you with just a couple of slides here. Cases Code of Conduct. So in addition to actions such as fines or imprisonment for noncompliance with applicable laws and regulations, consequences to the university at large may include the following. It can include an increase in federal audits, significant penalties, reduction or loss of funding, shutdown of projects, additional oversight and monitoring by the government, a compromise of professional integrity, and a risk to the university's reputation. And I would actually add to that, in the human subjects realm, 3 notable institutions, their research was shut down completely as a result of some violations of some of these things that we were talking about. Penn, Duke, and Johns Hopkins, all of their research was shut down at one point or another within the last 10 to 15 years due to violations of some of these kinds of issues. In addition to the entire VA, which was shut down for 2 weeks, I think. Every VA was not permitted to progress on any kind of research. Nothing was to be done. They had a stand down, they called it. And so these things can be pretty serious at some levels. And so it's very important to take it seriously. We talked about this a little bit, just the focus on responsible conduct in research. And so this isn't going away. All of these issues and all of these discussions are very important to keep in the front of your mind as you progress through your research. And that is my last slide. I am happy to take any questions now, or if you want to call me or email me later, I'm always happy to hear from everybody and happy to answer questions. Did I scare you? Are you awake? Yeah.
When you were talking about security and confidentiality of data, so if the apocalypse happens in Cleveland, I still want to graduate. So there's, internet storage sites that I think the Case Computing Center offers, a discount to students to store some data online. Does the university have a policy about that, about storing original research data online and these internet storage sites before it's published?
I am not familiar directly. It sounds like not my favorite idea. How's that? I'm not really familiar with the internet storage site, so I can't speak to that directly. I'm kind of, of the old-fashioned idea of a backup either on a jump drive that's stored somewhere else safely and securely. I don't know, do you guys, Chuck or Denise, do you have any thoughts on it? Yeah, I don't really know. I can look into it though and see. But and obviously, if the university recommends it, it just depends on the kinds of security issues associated with it. But anything associated with the internet just tends to make me think less secure than more, and I would be leery of it. Any other questions? Well, thank you very much for your attention.